Well, it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for this morning. It's Dr. Michael Hasel. Dr. Hasel is a historian, archaeologist, biblical scholar. He's spent over 30 years researching the ancient world. He completed his PhD at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Isn't that wonderful? Right here in our state, with distinction and honors. He served as a Samuel Frace Fellow and a senior Fulbright scholar as well. He has participated in and directed excavations at 12 different locations in the United States, Jordan, Cyprus, and Israel. Needless to say, Dr. Hasel has been around the world. Much of his research through his career has focused on coercive military tactics, particularly in ancient empires, including Egypt, the Hittites, Assyria, and Babylonia, and their impact on Israel. He's written several academic books on the subject of military activity and the historical developments that coalesce to make successful totalitarian regimes. His peer-reviewed articles have been published in leading journals, textbooks, encyclopedias, and reference works, and Dr. Hasel serves on the boards of leading academic societies and journals. He has lectured on every continent of the world except Antarctica, and I don't blame him for that. His wife, Giselle, is a professor of art history, and they have two grown daughters, Daniela and Sarah. Today, we are going to hear his research and experience some lessons from history, interspersing his family experiences living through the Nazi era in Germany. And if you heard some of the things Dr. McCullough just mentioned, those will be very applicable to what Dr. Hasel will be presenting. Dr. Hasel's story is an incredible family story, and it has been documented in the book, A Thousand Shall Fall, which myself and my family have read, I believe, about 5 times. If you haven't had the opportunity to read that book, I highly recommend it. It's been read not just by myself and my family, but by millions of people over the last 20 years since it was published. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing what Dr. Hasel will share with us, especially as we view our current crisis in light of history. Thank you.
Well, it is a privilege to be with you here today. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank especially both Dr. Lewis, who's the president of the Liberty Health Alliance, and Dr. Peter McCullough, and many others who have benefited and championed enormously these early treatments that many of us, have really benefited from. I know my family, my immediate family and I have benefited tremendously from this. We've all gone through COVID just in the last 2 months through the Delta wave. And we're here standing today thanks to those treatments. And I know many of you have experienced that as well. I want to thank them and countless other frontline workers in hospitals and in medical practice around the world during these last 2 years who have put their lives on the line and who have done everything possible to save lives. And I believe that is part of what we are here doing today, to encourage optimal health so that we can experience life as well. Who could have known that we would be here today? 8 weeks ago, this wasn't even in our thoughts, and suddenly here we are in the Chase Arena in Phoenix, Arizona. It's great to be back here in sunny Arizona. Our time here was our honeymoon years when we were first married, and we moved down to Tucson, Arizona, and I started my PhD studies at the University of Arizona. I know that's the rival school to the one here in Tempe, but anyway, it was a great place to be, and we love it down here. In fact, I brought my wife and my daughter Sarah here this weekend as well, and she's helping up in the children's department. If you would have told me 30 years ago, when I arrived at the University of Arizona, that I would spend much of my career writing about military tactics in history, I probably would have doubted your statement. You see, my family history was born out of the harrowing experience of World War I and World War II, wars that cost well over 100 million lives, many of them in the defense of freedom. My parents, partly as a result of their childhood, raised us children to be pacifists, not interested in conflict, but rather interested in peace. So a career analyzing military activities and the tactics of the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians were unlikely, to say the least. But I would like to suggest today that after that experience, sorry, I'm trying to make the slide go. There we go. After that experience at the University of Arizona and after spending the last 30 years studying history, I would like to suggest that we cannot change history, but we can determine in the present to do what is right. And we can do that on the basis of what we have learned through history. I do not believe, as many have stated over the years, that we study history, but we really repeat it over and over again. That's true, we often do, but we shouldn't, because we should study the past so that we can understand the failures and the victories and use those as we live in the present. Before I begin, I'd like to begin with the word of prayer. Let's bow our heads. God of heaven, we are but tiny specks in the cosmos of your creation. We are nothing in the vastness of the galaxies that you have created. And yet you have created us to live in relationship with you. You have created us out of love, a love that surpasses all understanding, and you have sent your Son, Jesus Christ, into this world to seek and to save the lost. That is all of us today, and we need you today, and I pray for your presence here through your Holy Spirit in this time and place. Thank you for your promises. In Jesus' name, amen. The title of my presentation today is Why History Matters Today. Why does history matter today? And I would like to suggest that as we go back in history, the Bible forms the basis of the Western tradition, of Western civilization. It was on its principles that this great republic, the United States, was founded. The Bible is unique when compared to all other ancient religious or sacred texts of all other major world religions in two ways. Number one, it is constituted in history, and number two, 30% of the Bible contains prophecy. These two elements make it completely unique and unparalleled in any other world religion. And I've spent my life studying these religions in ancient times and somewhat in modern times as well. The Bible teaches that there is a personal God, a God who acts in history, actively working to bring about his plan of salvation. In the Bible, time is not cyclical, moving in circles and repeating itself over and over again. No, in the Bible, time is linear. It has an absolute beginning. In the first chapter of Genesis, when it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," and it moves forward in a linear fashion with a purpose and with a mission in mind. The Bible, you see, has a mission of after the fall, when all humanity is pointed towards the coming Messiah, the promised Messiah who will redeem the lost. And those promises are repeated hundreds of times in the Old Testament, and in many places with such detailed accuracy, 65 of those prophecies with such detailed accuracy, that as we read through the Old Testament and we see how God has fulfilled history and prophecy, we can see how these things come together. It's interesting that today in our Western culture, we still refer to the ultimate act in human history, Christ coming into this world and dying on the cross of Calvary. We still refer to that act in history as the dividing line between history. We still refer to it as BC and AD, at least in most Christian countries, although there's some politically correct ways of referring to that as well. And there's another aspect that is important here, because the Bible is constituted in history, true, and that means that its history can be tested and that it can be evaluated. In other words, God allows us to go back in history and to look at how these things are fulfilled and what takes place. The nations and people it speaks of have been well documented over 2 centuries of archaeological research and work. Beginning in the 1800s, when Assyria was laid open to early explorers, and archaeologists began to uncover the images and the text documenting the horrific intimidation and terror tactics of a great empire as it swept through the ancient Near East. And here you see some images from their temple walls and their palace walls depicting the gruesome military tactics that they used to conquer nations, to conquer cities, and to deport individuals. The phraseology that is used over and over again in these texts: I conquered, I burnt to the ground, I razed to the ground, I destroyed, I took captives. And the details of those military tactics are clearly borne out. Often they would impale the leaders of the cities as examples to the rest of the population for standing against their expanding empire. And in my excavations, as you can see from this picture here, we have slingers depicted in ancient Nineveh, now in the British Museum. We have uncovered at places like Lachish and other important cities that were conquered in Judah. We have uncovered the details of those great devastations and those great destructions, including hundreds of sling stones that were used and that they depicted in the palace of Sennacherib itself. Yet in what seemed like an impossible situation, the contemporary prophet Isaiah prophesies and says this to the king of Judah: "For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." You see, God spoke through his prophets. He promised through his prophets again and again deliverance. And not only did he promise deliverance, he supplied deliverance. We have a God who is faithful, faithful to his promises, faithful to his word, a God that we can trust not only in history, but today. The Babylonians did the same, building an empire around victims and deported captives that would serve them or face the consequences enacted upon their cities as they were ransacked and destroyed. Yet in that same oppressive system, God used Daniel and his friends to reach Babylon's mighty king, Nebuchadnezzar. This afternoon, I'll be sharing more about that in one of the breakout sessions. These details, as well as the broad overview of thousands of years of history, reveal the unmistakable patterns that we can see in civilization after civilization that are repeated and that we even see still repeated today. 1, building up an extensive military machine to conquer and enforce an ideology. 2, using and sometimes creating a crisis to cause fear and intimidation. 3, enacting measures to remove human rights in extreme circumstances. 5, ensuring the consistency of one message through the media to enable the rewriting of history for a specific purpose. We have seen this over and over again in history, and I can repeat many examples of this. I don't have time today, but I've written about them, I've published about them, and you can read about them in history. Study history, for in history we learn the mistakes of the past. In the 20th century, in the last 100 years, we have also witnessed the rise of totalitarian regimes built on the same principles, but now using more deadly and more effective weapons and more extensive methods of coercion to control populations and to conquer vast territories. Using the same time-proven tactics, Communism and socialism and fascism perpetuated their ideologies through mass propaganda and the redefinition of history, each in their own way competing for territory, using their citizens as human fodder to accomplish their globalist agenda of worldwide domination. For millennia, people have been forced, coerced, and manipulated, and their freedoms threatened, and so it was with my family in World War II. My father always told me that he was born on the wrong side of the ocean at the wrong time of human history. My father is sitting on his dad's lap, the youngest boy in this picture. My grandfather, Franz, my grandmother, Helena Hasel, with their 3 children here, Kurt in the center. Kurt just passed away from COVID a few days ago at the age of 91. Lotte, who lives in California now, sitting on her mother's lap, and my dad, little Gerhard, sitting on his father's lap. This picture was taken in Vienna just before they moved to Frankfurt, Germany. My father, you see, was raised in Nazi Germany and was 10 years old when the war ended. My father, his father, I should say, my grandfather in this picture, was drafted into the German army. And in 1939, right at the beginning of the war, at the age of 40, he didn't think he was going to be drafted. He thought he was too old, but he was drafted because he'd already had experience in World War I. As a teenager, he had been drafted in World War I in the last year of the war at the age of 18. But since then, he had had a conversion experience in his life. He had become a born-again Christian, and he had been a student of the Bible. He had become a minister of the gospel. And now, so many years later, at the age of 40, as this regime began to take over Germany, my grandfather determined that he needed to be faithful to God rather than to men. His father had also served at that time as well. He knew that he had to follow God's commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." And he remembered the passage in Scripture that says we ought to obey God rather than man. He recognized that the spirit of coercion that had become so dominant in his country was not the spirit of Christ, which was based on love and the freedom of choice and conscience. For my grandfather, the status of conscientious objector did not exist in the German army. Unlike the heroic Desmond Doss of Hacksaw Ridge, a fellow Seventh-day Adventist Christian on the other side of the lines, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution offered Desmond Doss much broader protections than it did to my grandfather during the Second World War. So to ensure that he would not even be tempted to kill, my grandfather had a master carver in France during the beginning of the war in 1939 carve him a perfect replica of his government-issued pistol, which he afterwards threw into a local river. For the next 6 years, in a holster just like this, concealing that wooden gun, he carried that wooden gun through the heart of Russia and the Ukraine as he served in the German army. He did not want to even be tempted to use the weapon that he had been trained to use as a teenager in the Second World War, and so he removed all temptation. He wanted to be true to his conscience. When he reported for duty, he was placed in a medical unit as a medic. He requested to be placed in a medical unit as a medic to save lives rather than to take lives, like Desmond Doss had done in the Pacific. But instead, he was assigned to an engineering unit building bridges on the front lines. Unit 699 was a bridge-building unit that built bridges for the advancing army and was often behind enemy lines and in the worst danger, and the atrocities and the casualties there were horrendous. At the beginning of his time, 1,200 men were placed in that unit in 1939. And as Operation Barbarossa took effect, he found himself heading into the heart of Russia. Meanwhile, my grandmother, who's pictured here with her 3 children, were back in Frankfurt on the home front. My grandmother was a very quiet and humble person. She was unassuming, but very resolute. Almost every night, there were air raids that would fly over the city of Frankfurt, dropping their deadly payloads. I remember a few years ago with an uncle of mine, Uncle Willie, going around in North Carolina Lake. We were taking a walk a few years ago, and Uncle Willie asked me, he says, "What do you think I wished for more than anything else during the war growing up as a child?" He also was an immigrant from Germany after the World War. And he had me guessing for 45 minutes, and finally, when I finally gave up and didn't guess anymore, I said toys, I said food, I said all kinds of things. Finally, I said generically, world peace. He said, well, close, but more specifically, he said, I prayed every night for one night of uninterrupted sleep when the air raid sirens would not be going off and I would not be forced down into the bunker. One night of uninterrupted sleep. That was my father's childhood growing up in Frankfurt, Germany as well, until the age of 10. In fact, his earliest memories were nothing but the war. Many times, our family was miraculously saved from those bombings, and I don't have time to tell all those stories today. The apartment building they lived in that you just saw a moment ago, where my grandmother and her children were standing in front of, is still standing today, by the way, after all these years. One day, there was a loud knock on the door. Kurt, the oldest, went to go open the door, and there stood a very fine-looking gentleman wearing a civilian suit, kind of like mine. In the lapel of his jacket was a pin, like the one you see on the screen here, a pin of the Nazi Party with the swastika in the middle of that pin, and around it, you know what Nazi stands for, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. I thought we fought that war 80 years ago, and now it's back in our midst, isn't it? And so he stood there. He had an armband around his arm with a swastika on it as well, and he had a very friendly look. And with that, he asked my Uncle Kurt whether his mother was there. And so Kurt went and got his mother in the kitchen. They came back out, and the children were ushered into the kitchen. My grandmother went back out and began speaking with this gentleman. When she was done with the conversation and he had left, she came back into the kitchen where the children were, and she said, "Children, now we must pray." What happened? Well, your father and I have just been invited to join the Nazi Party. Back then, you couldn't just join the party. You had to be invited to join the party, and being invited was a privilege, and it was a great thing. It was something that meant you got twice as many rations a month as everybody else did. It meant you were invited to the greatest events in the city, the opera, the concerts, the social events. You were among the elite politically in Germany at that time. And so my grandmother was faced with a major decision. She was faced with a difficult decision as a devout Christian. She knew that she could never join the party. She had already made the daring decision when walking through the streets of the city not to give the Nazi salute and to say Heil Hitler. She simply said in a very friendly way with a very large smile, "Good afternoon, guten Tag, guten Morgen, good morning." And she went about her business. It was her way of silently saying, I'm not going along with what is happening in my country right now. But at the end of the month, now faced with this crisis, as she had told the official, she says, I don't make decisions like this by myself. I need to have some time. And so she told him that she would write to her husband and find out what he decided. And she said, we don't make decisions of this great importance alone. We always consult with one another. I think that's a good thing, even today, don't you? So at the end of the month, when no paycheck from the government arrived, she brought up the issue at church at the following Wednesday night prayer meeting. And a Sister Geiser told her that they would provide her with money, not to worry about it. They would loan her the money. She went with my grandmother to the bank, and there at the bank, she took out her life savings and she handed my grandmother the money. And my grandmother gasped for breath as she realized that that would support her and her family for 6 months. She said, Sister Geiser, I can't accept this from you. I can't take this money from you. This is your life savings. And Sister Geiser says, Sister Hasel, we don't know whether we're going to be here tomorrow or a month from now or a year from now. You need this money now. And if we both survive, I know that you'll pay me back. Take the money. You have young children. My husband and I are old. We don't need it right now. So my grandmother began to write letters to the government agencies trying to find out why the checks didn't arrive month after month after month. She wrote a letter to her husband on the front lines explaining her desperation. And a few days later, a summons arrived for a meeting following Monday with Herr Springer, the Gauleiter, or the head of the Nazi party for the entire city of Frankfurt. The Nazi headquarters were located in a building, a brown house it was known as. This is not the building, by the way. I don't think the building stands anymore, but this is a brown house in a German city. You can use your imagination. It was a very imposing building, and it had a reputation because people who were summoned there were rarely ever seen again. In fact, there was a rumor among the children that there were door handles going into the building, but there were no door handles to get out of the building. And sure enough, when my grandmother arrived, that was her experience in some way. You had to push a buzzer and you were let into the building, and you had to have somebody let you out as well. She knew that there were unspeakable atrocities that occurred within the walls of that building by the Gestapo, the secret police. And she knew that in that situation, she may never see her children again. So she gathered the children together and they prayed. They were instructed not to go to school that Monday when she had the appointment. Instead, they were to wait for their mother to return. But in case she did not return, special arrangements had been made with church members where they were to be kept in safety, where they were to leave individually in case mother didn't return. They are not after me, she said to her children. They're after you. They know I will not change my mind, but they know that they will be able to break your minds if they can put you into special schools and brainwash you. And so, whatever happens, children, stay true to God. My father was 7 years old when this conversation happened, and this is him on his first day at first grade at that age. Maybe he was 6 at that time. My father told me later he was told to take several streetcars to his destination should his mother not return. They were not to tell each of the siblings where they were going because if the Gestapo caught one of them, my grandmother didn't want them to break the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. And so it was safer for them not to know where their siblings were going, so everything was kept very secret. They prayed earnestly and hugged each other as my grandmother left for the brown house Monday morning. And as they waited throughout the morning, as streetcar after streetcar came through, but none of them bore their mother, finally, just before 12 o'clock, the last streetcar arrived before they were to go their separate ways, and they saw one pair of legs moving quickly from the tree that was blocking the view, more quickly than the others. And they saw and recognized it was their mom. They said, "Yay, Mom's home!" "Shh, the Halabachs, they're the Nazi spies in our building. Quiet, they can't know we're home and not in school today." And mother came in, and there were hugs, and there were kisses, and then my grandmother explained to them, "Children, I need to tell you about the miracle that took place today." When I arrived, I handed my summons papers in and was told to go up to the 11th floor. There was a large office, and a large walnut desk with a polished brass nameplate that said Gauleiter Springer. Behind sat a man in uniform with an armband on his right arm, and he stood up and asked me to sit down. But I told him I would remain and prefer to remain standing. Then, opening a folder in front of him, he asked whether my grandmother knew why she was there that day. She replied that there had been some months earlier an invitation to join the party, but that she had not given an answer until she had heard from her husband. Yes, he said, I have very incriminating documents here on my desk that state that you have refused to join the Nazi Party, that you refused to join the League of Women, and that your children do not attend school on Saturday. Are you a Jew by any chance? My grandmother said, no, I'm not a Jew, but I keep the Sabbath that the Jews keep because I am a Protestant Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and I worship on Saturday because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day and has instructed us to do the same in his commandments. God wrote with his own finger that we ought to keep the Sabbath and to keep it holy, and that law has never changed. He stared at her for a very long time, and then he reached for the phone, and he picked it up and he said, please check if Frau Hasel is a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He waited for a few moments and the telephone rang back and it was confirmed. The man's attitude as he waited for that returning phone call had changed a little bit. When the phone call came in and he listened, well, he began to have a hint of a smile on his face. It wasn't a sarcastic or evil smile. It was a nice smile, actually. My grandmother began to feel a little hope in her heart. And then he said, I know about Seventh-day Adventists. Do you know the Schneiders by any chance? And my grandmother knew the Schneiders well. He was the head elder, the acting pastor, actually, in their church while her husband was on the front lines. But not being certain whether she should talk about the Schneiders and get them in trouble with the Brown House and the Nazi Party, she hesitated for a moment. In that moment, the gentleman continued and says, I know the Schneiders well. You see, our house was recently bombed and we had to move, and our new next-door neighbors are the Schneiders. And they have been the most wonderful and hospitable neighbors that we have ever had, that my wife and I have ever experienced. And in fact, they've invited us over for dinner. They've brought us fresh baked bread. They have been beautiful neighbors. And they're Seventh-day Adventist Christians, and so are you. He closed the folder in front of him, and then he said, Frau Hasel, I am so sorry to have disturbed you today. I will dig into this matter, and I will resolve this matter for you. You say you have not received your child support checks. What do you think has happened to them? And she said, I believe they were stopped because of my refusal to join the party. But I'm telling you now that I will not join the party. I will continue to keep the Sabbath, and I will be faithful to God no matter what the consequences. I cannot join a party that is based on atheistic principles. I will remain true to my conscience. He stood to his feet. Frau Hasel, I admire your spirit. I too believe in the freedom to believe what we choose to believe. And don't worry about the money. I will see to that. My grandmother didn't know what to say, so she choked out the words, Herr Springer, thank you so very much. Oh, about that, Frau Hasel. I'm actually not Herr Springer. The Gauleiter became very ill this morning and could not come to the office. I'm his deputy. But I have full jurisdiction in this matter, and I will see to it that this office will never bother you again. She was soon notified that she could pick up the child support check from the government and found that all the back payments were there as well. She paid back Sister Geiser, and true to his promise, she never heard from the party headquarters again. God had delivered them and had fulfilled his promise found in Psalm 91, verses 3 through 4. Surely he shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler, and from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. Sometime later, there was another knock on the door. This time it was a neighbor from the same apartment building, Frau Neumann. Frau Hasel, I have a desperate situation. Can you hide a Jewish boy in your apartment just for the time being? The Gestapo are on their way. I've just been informed that they're almost here. Please help me. My grandmother had no idea that she was part of the underground, sneaking Jews out of the country, and she only hesitated for a moment and said, please bring him now. A 13-year-old boy was brought immediately to her apartment and quickly hidden in a closet. And sure enough, when the Gestapo arrived, they did not find him. And they did not find him in the neighbor's apartment. They began searching the entire apartment complex, one apartment after another. And now she was faced with the major ethical dilemma. What would she do? Finally, they were at her door. They knocked, and she opened it. We have a search warrant. We are under the suspicion of hiding a Jew. You know what will happen if we find him. And she was faced with the decision. Would she lie to protect the boy's life? Would she do that and go against everything she had taught her children? And yet, would she risk the boy's life? Are you hiding a Jew? They asked directly. And at that moment, it just came to her mind as she said a silent prayer. She says, please, gentlemen, come in and search my apartment. We didn't ask you that. We asked you specifically if you're hiding a Jew in your apartment. She says, gentlemen, you are free to come in and search wherever you'd like. They looked at each other very confused, and they said a third time, we are asking you a direct question. Are you hiding someone in your apartment? And at that moment, my grandmother stood back, flung open the door. Gentlemen, I've invited you in now for the third time. Please come and look wherever you would like. The Gestapo looked at each other, thanked her, and went to the next apartment. In this situation, my grandmother maintained her integrity, and God stepped in and saved a young man. Sometimes when we take matters into our own hands and try to solve an ethical dilemma, is it possible that we may be keeping God from directly working out a plan that he wants to work out with us, for us, if we remain faithful to him? He has promised in Psalm 91, 1 through 2, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. And I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I will trust. Meanwhile, as the war was raging on the Russian front, Germany's forces had driven into the heart of Russia with blitzkrieg speed. My grandfather was part of that southern flank, moving through the Caucasus Mountains toward the city of Baku, located on the Caspian Sea. Hitler vowed that the Third Reich, uniting Europe and Russia, would last 1,000 years. My grandfather and his unit had fought their way through the Ukraine, and they had that one goal of capturing the city of Baku, which held the oil reserves for the entire Russian military force and still is a very important oil center today. If Hitler could capture the city of Baku, then he might turn the tide of the war, providing the important gasoline and oil for his military machine. One day, my grandfather, who was in this bridge building unit that I explained, the Russians would bomb the bridges to keep the Germans from advancing, and he was part of a unit that would build pontoon bridges across these, often overnight, so that the German troops could advance. Here is a picture of my grandfather standing in the foreground this is the Dnieper River in the Ukraine, one of the largest rivers, and you can see the pontoon bridge that is being built next to the bombed out bridge in the foreground there. By the way, my uncle some years ago found a little tiny box when he moved from central Germany to the southern part of Germany. In his retirement, he found a small box with a swastika on it and opened the box, which he had never seen before. And inside were 100 of these original photographs that my grandfather, who was the clerk of that unit and kept track of all the records, had and kept after the war. And so we have these original photographs. One day, my grandfather was asked a very specific question. He was asked whether, by his commanding officer, Hauptmann Mikas, do you think Germany is going to win this war? My grandfather knew that the expected patriotic answer for any soldier was, of course, that Germany is going to win this war. The fatherland will be victorious, and we will usher in a new age for all people that will last hundreds of years. But my grandfather also knew from studying prophecy in Scripture, particularly from the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, that Germany could, in fact, never win the war. Is it possible that the Bible still has relevance for us today? And that we can rely on what Scripture says about the past and about the future as we wrestle with major issues today? My grandfather believed so, and in that particular moment, as he wrestled with this question, he didn't know how to answer, because he knew if he would answer according to the Bible, he was placing his life in danger. No one would dare to defy the patriotic nature of the nationalistic regime of Germany at that time. And yet, as he prayed, he suddenly got an idea, and he asked his commanding officer, is this an official or an unofficial question? They had an unwritten rule that if you took your hat off as an officer, you could answer and talk about things unofficially. It was off the record. It wouldn't be held. The commanding officer, Mikus, only hesitated for a moment and said, you may answer unofficially. So my grandfather reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn black book that he had been carrying with him throughout the war, a Bible. He opened it up to Daniel chapter 2, and he told a story to his commanding officer. Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king of Babylon, had experienced a tremendous and terrible dream. In that dream, well, he didn't remember when he woke up what was in that dream. And he called all the wise men, and he called all the counselors together from all the realm, and he asked them, please tell me what I dreamed and interpret my dream for me. They replied in Daniel chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, it is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. These men knew what was possible, even in their mythical worldview, in their polytheistic religion. They knew what was possible and what was not. The king was furious, and he ordered their execution. That execution order included Daniel and his 3 friends who had been taken captive some years earlier. But Daniel and his friends asked for time, and they asked to pray. And they got together and prayed and fasted that the God of heaven would reveal the dream and its interpretation, and God answered their prayer. And when Daniel received the royal audience to visit with Nebuchadnezzar, the Bible says he told the king, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. That's our days today. The dream would inform the future. And Daniel informed Nebuchadnezzar of a dream that he dreamed of an image with a head of gold and arms and chest of silver and thighs of brass and legs of iron and feet of iron mixed with clay. Daniel explained these as successive empires, and my grandfather shared with a little slip of paper that he had stuck in that book of Daniel and that he had unfolded. He showed this image and he described how the various empires had come to be, how Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, October 22 to be precise, ushering in the Medo-Persian Empire. The Greeks dreamed to avenge themselves after the Medo-Persians under King Xerxes, the same King Xerxes that we read about in the Bible in the book of Esther as Ahasuerus, as he had desecrated the temples on the Acropolis of Athens. And in 334 BC, Alexander the Great crossed the Dardanelles into Asia, conquering the Medo-Persian Empire in a series of battles, establishing the Third Kingdom, the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. Ancient Rome would overthrow Greece in 168 BC and establish an even more extensive empire that encompassed all of Europe. But Rome, like the preceding empires, would not last. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, Daniel said to the king, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with clay. Rome would continue in the iron down to the end of time. The toes represented the broken up Roman Empire into the European states. My grandfather continued, and as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Royal families, my grandfather explained, had tried to hold Europe together through intermarriage. Napoleon tried to unite Europe militarily, but each attempt had failed. And from this panorama of history, he explained, Europe will not be united then, and it will not be united now. Hitler will not win this war. The Third Reich will not last 1,000 years. Hauptmann Micus was silent. He asked my grandfather for his Bible, and then he ordered my grandfather to return at a later time. My grandfather left the meeting, and that night he prayed, God, please bless the words from your word that I shared today. May they not return void and empty, but may they find a place in the heart of my friend and commanding officer, Micus. And God, he said, please restore me to your word. I cannot imagine how I will survive the rest of this ordeal without having your word to comfort me and to guide me each step of the way. As my grandfather arrived to the next meeting, he was surprised to see two other high-ranking officers present. He was handed back his Bible and asked to repeat the entire study, but this time his commanding officer again asked everyone to remove their hats and told everyone that everything that had spoken there was off the record and that, in fact, the meeting had never taken place. It was a nearly 2-hour Bible study, and again, my grandfather went through these specific events that took place in history. And when he got down to the punchline that Hitler would not win the war and that the Third Reich would not last 1,000 years, he was finally introduced to the two men who were both there standing on either side of his commanding officer. Both had been history professors before being drafted into the German army like every other able-bodied man in Germany. And Commander Mikus said, they have confirmed the history and the historical sequence of the events and the dates provided. And after he dismissed the two men, he said to my grandfather, I want you to quietly ration every ounce of gasoline that we have, operate only 1/3 of the motorized vehicles in the days to come. We have to prepare for the journey home. Sometime later, Germany surrendered in May 8, 1945, and the ration gasoline provided for Unit 699's retreat back to Austria and back into an American internment camp in Braunau. This is the paper that my grandfather had that year in 1945. You can do the math how many years ago that was now. It's still in our family. Of the original 1,200 men assigned to Unit 699 in 1939. Only 7 of those original men survived. This is a funeral service in that unit that you're seeing here. There were many of them. The unit was replaced 4 times over the course of the war. There were about 4,000 men that went through that unit. Of the original 1,200 that my grandfather was part of, only 7 survived. Of those 7 men, only 3 had never been wounded. My grandfather and his commanding officer were 2 of those 3 men. Psalm 91, 7 through 8 says, 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. Only with your eyes shall you look and see the reward of the wicked. God has worked in the past history, and he is still working today. This is a picture of the last picture that we have from that stack of about 100 photographs. It's the only one that is not carefully dated in the back with a careful and very well detailed description. My grandfather was very, very meticulous as the clerk of that unit. But it's my grandfather that is smiling, the closest one that you see in the front of this picture. And I'd like to think that this is him on his way home. This is the list, original list of the 1,200 men, one of the pages, the one that contained the name of my grandfather with his address and his rank. And it wasn't until a few years later, after the war, that my father and my mother later immigrated to the United States. My father was 22. They came independently of each other. They only met here in this country. But as my father's ship, and you see him here looking at the camera in the blue suit, the one not covering his eyes, as his ship arrived in the United States and came into New York Harbor, he often told me how the view of the Statue of Liberty sent chills down his back and caused him to become very emotional. Like millions of others before them since the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620, they had suffered great persecution and now had arrived on the shores of a new land with promised freedom to the destitute and liberty to the captives. My mother was a German refugee in Yugoslavia. She's the little girl in these 2 pictures. That's her older sister, Maria, and Maria's grandson is our photographer for this event today. Their family were refugees from Yugoslavia who, after spending time in a camp in Hungary, arrived at age 9 with her 2 sisters and her mother on the shores of the United States. Her father had been killed, as many others, as a result of the war. They had absolutely nothing. They had 1 wooden case. My sister still has that case with the address, their final address, Berrien Springs, Michigan. They had their clothes on their back. They didn't speak a word of English. When they were met at the harbor in New York, they were given each a $5 bill, a red delicious apple, and a sandwich. They thought it was cake because it was made out of a kind of Wonder Bread, you know, the kind of American bread we have over here. And when they tasted it, they couldn't believe that cake tasted like that in the United States. This week, it was the church in America who had sponsored their immigration. And I'd like to say that it's the Village Seventh-day Adventist Church that is one of the sponsors of this event today, here. You're going to hear from the pastor of that church, Pastor Ron Kelly, in our next presentations. This week, I asked my mother, just a couple days ago, as I was preparing this, been preparing it for some time, but I asked her, Mom, what has this country provided to our family? And I want to share with you what she answered to me on Thursday. It provided a country, she said, to call home, because we were displaced refugees without a country. America provided safety, it provided freedom, and it provided opportunity. My mother, who spoke not a word of English when she arrived, would later finish graduate school at Vanderbilt University and enter a career teaching hundreds of children how to read for the first time as a first and second grade teacher. Today, I meet her students all over the world when I travel and lecture. They are pastors and teachers. They are doctors and lawyers. They're missionaries, and they are fathers and they are mothers. My father, who arrived here at 22, became a professor, also graduated with his PhD from Vanderbilt, founded a PhD program at another university that has trained hundreds of theologians to go around the world at institutions of higher learning, taught there for 31 years, wrote hundreds of peer-reviewed articles and textbooks on biblical theology and prophecy. Last week, I was on the phone with one of his publishers, and it is still one of their best-selling textbooks after 40 years, translated into multiple languages. Why was this possible? Only because of the freedom and opportunity that this country provided. Friends, we cannot mistake a very important fact right now. I was talking to one of our sponsors just a few moments ago, yesterday, in fact, and he said, "We are at war today." I don't believe it is a war against a virus, although that is perhaps part of it. It is not a war against a vaccine. We have the freedom to choose to take that or not. But it is a war against an ideology that would use this virus to threaten the very freedom that our Constitution and the Bill of Rights stand for. We are at war with a globalist agenda that would attempt to reset humanity for the common good by removing the fundamental freedoms of democracy built on the Western tradition. But I want to ask you the question today. In this war, who decides what is for the common good? Is it a few people? Is it a few elites? Or is it the people? Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address, as he stood over the battlefield of one of the deadliest wars in American history, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, and by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Today, we are at a war for the very soul of our country and our families. And not only for our country, but for the whole of Western civilization. And are we simply to stand by as people's freedom to choose, the fundamental basic physical basis of who we are, is so universally threatened? Once this fundamental right is removed and relinquished, there is nothing that prevents the physical and spiritual independence of every human soul to be removed. In Germany, the loss of freedom was not overnight. It was an incremental process. Its steps led to a mass psychosis carefully documented by historians that led to the genocides and events that international courts deemed to be unethical today, yet they were lawful for that country at that time. I would like to end today by saying, we must not be afraid. Fear is the tool of manipulation and control. In the Bible, fear is the tool of the adversary. But love is the tool, and freedom of conscience is the tool of the government of Jesus Christ. God, who established freedom as the fundamental principle of his government, is the God who promises that he will never leave us or forsake us. Hundreds of times in Scripture, as Dr. King pointed out yesterday, we see the words, "Fear not," or "Do not be afraid." And so our family, and you can see the grown family here, my grandparents and their 4 children, my father's on the far left-hand side, in this funny shot many years after the war. Our family grew up with a wooden plaque hanging in our home in Michigan, the same one that used to hang in the foyer of my grandparents' apartment in Frankfurt, Germany during the war. It is engraved with the promise of Jesus found in Matthew 28, verse 20. "And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world." My family experienced the end of their age in Europe and the beginning of a new one in this country. And Jesus also spoke of a new age and a new country he's preparing for us. In John chapter 14, 1 through 3, he left his disciples with these words, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you, but I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Later in the Gospel of John, Jesus would add these words in John chapter 16, verse 13. "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." As Laura comes up to sing, I would like, as she sings this morning, for you to reflect quietly on why you are here as God's servant today. What has he called you to stand up for today? What has he placed on your conscience today as you look around at your neighbors and your families, your friends, in a very divided world that we live? How has he called you to love? How has he called you to seek and to save? How has he called you to uplift the liberty of conscience? Today I stand here grateful for history. Yes, I stand grateful for history, for the tremendous example of those that have come before us. I'm grateful for my grandparents who were faithful. I'm grateful for my parents who inculcated those ideas in a land of freedom, telling us stories of things we could only imagine that we did not experience. I'm thankful for the eternal values of truth and the courage to stand. And I've chosen to stand today, and I invite you to stand today for the gift of freedom that this country has offered my family and yours. And I reaffirm that pledge, which we repeated every day in school as I was growing up in elementary school, as we stood in front of the flag of this country. And to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.